All right, so welcome to Spring Bloom 2021, everyone. I am Nathan Riggs with SAWS Conservation. I'm a program coordinator, one of your hosts, and with me is my boss, the director of conservation, Karen Guz. Hi, Karen.
Good morning, Nathan. And good morning, everybody else who's on. Nathan, I'm working on sharing my slides here. Let me know if you can see them, just so we're sure that's all set. Okay, great. So Nathan and I are both going to be talking with you this morning about toddler plants and their weed foes, but it's really more than that. Our goal here is to talk to you about what to expect when you first plant your garden and when you're just getting it started, and then what to expect really the next year or two, and what challenges you might come across and how to minimize those so you get to success as soon as possible. Let's see.
Now, one thing that we want to remind everyone is there is a Q&A box button here for you to click on. If you have a question as we're going through, please be sure to type that into the Q&A, and we will get to those questions as we go through, maybe catch them at the end. And we are just glad to see everybody here with us. So just wanted to remind that little housekeeping bit here. Be sure if you have a question to put it in the Q&A so that we can go through those.
And Nathan, we do seem to be experiencing a little technical glitch here.
What do you see?
What's happening? That it's not letting me advance the slides.
Oh, really?
So I may need to have you share them. Oh, wait, it just let it move
on
forward.
the left side of your screen, there's a little oblong thing with magnifying glasses and a 1. Click the little arrow below the 1, and that should advance your slide. Do you see that?
Sorry, I'm looking. Before I just got to move it forward the way I do normally. And that's certainly not working. Let's see. Find glasses.
But if it's not working, I can advance them from here, it appears.
Okay, let's have you advance the slides because it just doesn't seem to want to cooperate for me.
All right.
The way it normally does when I give presentations online. So let's go to the first slide.
So
you go, Nathan.
Yeah, when we think of having a landscape in San Antonio, there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but the goal is to have a gorgeous landscape in your eyes, and it's a combination of things that can occur, and all of those landscapes just don't get pretty because you put the plants in the ground and then you just let them go. There's a lot of steps that you need to take to get to a pretty landscape bed like this, and that's what we want to do today. We want to take you through the steps so that you can understand that it's a process that you have to go through.
And getting to this point of having a mature, beautiful landscape may have some glitches along the way. And we want to share what some of those are based on personal experience Nathan and I both have. So that if you run across some of these challenges, you don't get discouraged and quit. Realize that even if you run across a problem with getting your landscape established, you very likely can overcome it and get to this point. So let's go to the next slide where we're going to list what some of those challenges might be. I'm showing a picture here of a landscape that is in transition, and it is going to be beautiful. I'm confident of that. This is in my neighborhood. This is a neighbor of mine that is doing a water saver landscape using our coupon programs. And I probably should have shown side by side over to the right where she's already done a successful landscape that looks fabulous. But this one was not planted too long ago before the freeze. And she hadn't had an opportunity to put mulch down. It's all warm season perennials. And so the plants she put in are still alive. But right now, in this image, all you see is very happy winter weeds. And so this could be really discouraging if this happened in your landscape. But we're going to talk about why all is not lost at all on this landscape. This one's still going to succeed. But we're going to back it up to talking about the barriers to success long term, starting with plant selection and getting them in the ground in the way that's going to help them be the plants, your new plants, those toddlers, be as successful as possible. We're going to talk about the tender loving care that the plants need, especially when they're first put in the ground, and frankly, probably kind of all through the first year. We're going to talk about weather. You can't be in San Antonio without talking about the weather, whether it's the heat of the summer or the freeze we just had. And then the bane of all gardeners' existence is weeds. So we're going to be spending some time on weeds.
Definitely the bane of this image right here, weeds for sure.
Yeah, it is. But this is going to, they've actually, I walked by it the other day, and this is already looking better. They've already pulled out a lot of those winter weeds, and I think they're getting ready to lay down a layer of mulch. But let's go to the next slide.
So when you go to the nursery, you're thinking about getting plants. A lot of people go to the nursery and they see all these beautiful plants and they see color. But one thing you really need to do is check out the little label that comes in there, because a lot of times these labels are not really tailored for Texas. They're tailored for different environments across the country. And as all of us know, Texas weather is crazy. Just think about what we just went through. We had 7 days of below freezing temperatures, and then 7-10 days later it was 65 degrees. That's nuts. And so you want to read that label and understand what you're getting, how big the plant's going to be, how much is it going to spread out, and what are the sun requirements, soil requirements, everything like that.
And the part that I say is not necessarily Texas accurate, I think really boils down to the sun exposure. I read these labels, and sometimes they'll say, that this plant will do great in partial sun or full sun. And I think that might mean like Pennsylvania sun, where I grew up. It may not mean full exposure, baking hot Texas sun, because they're, the number of plants I'd put in unrelieved sun is a little more limited than some of these labels would suggest. So let's go to the next slide for a suggestion we have, which is that you consider a local resource when you do your planning. And we're going to keep bringing up our favorite resource because it's developed by our colleagues and other experts right here in San Antonio, which is gardenstylesanantonio.com. You might not realize that this website has this just outstanding feature called Find a Plant. And it's quite frankly a lot of fun. If you're planning out your garden, you can go through here, and I couldn't show all of them because you'd have to scroll down, but you can click on water requirement and say, I want something that's going to be very low water use. I want purple flowers and I want deer resistant. And then you can keep adding features like I want it to attract hummingbirds. And then this is going to show you of this vast plant database, which plants seem to meet what you're looking for in your design and your preferred aesthetic, or whether or not you have deer. Whatever your preferences are, go shopping on Garden Style before you go shopping in the nursery. And this will give you a sense of what people here in San Antonio really think is going to happen in your garden. The other area we'd suggest you go to is garden resources. We're going to come back to that near the end, but you can take a look at that to get design layouts that somebody already did if you want to just cut straight to show me a design I could just use. But look at these resources more than you look at the labels in the nurseries.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing about especially the Find a Plant section is these aren't stock photos. These photos were taken by conservation staff and gardeners here in San Antonio. So these are local plants. These are actual local things that are growing in and around our area. So you can rest assured that you're not just getting a pretty picture of something that may or may not work here. All of these pictures are taken right here in our area. So you can feel good about them.
That's true.
So when you're at the nursery, you want to be able to find plants that you sort of are looking to put into your landscape. And you want to pick something that's healthy. You know, a lot of times you're drawn to a plant because it's got a ton of blooms on it already in the pot, and it's going to be gorgeous and lots of color and things like that. But you kind of have to check yourself and allow yourself to get past that pretty color, because you need to take a closer look at the plant itself. Does the plant have a lot of healthy leaves? Does it have strong stems? And if you pull it out of its tray, are there a lot of roots jutting out of the holes in the bottom? If you've got a lot of roots coming out of the bottom, that's an indication that that little plant may have been in this pot for a while, and it could potentially be getting root bound. You want tons of roots, yes, but you don't want so many that it's just coming out of the bottom of the pot and could potentially cause problems for this little plant later. So yes, the colors are pretty, but you want to take a look at the plant itself.
Yeah, I agree with that, Nathan. And it's always exciting when you see the color, because then you really know what the bloom color is going to be. But it may not perform the way you're looking at it in the nursery for a full year or until another season goes by. So you buy it with those flowers in full bloom, you put it in the ground, it may drop those flowers pretty quickly, and then it's going to put its energy possibly into just growing. So one tip is, if you're really after flowers for a particular season, take a look at when they bloom and plant them the season before. So if you're looking for spring blooms, plant them in the fall. If you're looking for fall blooms, try to get them in the spring. That's just sort of a general rule of thumb for getting the best show in your landscape as fast as possible. And if you do get really enamored of a plant that looks like it's got a lot of roots growing all over the pot, it's not that you can't plant that plant. We've all done it. You just have to tease those roots out so they're not going in a circle around the pot before you stick it in the ground. Now, soil is something that Nathan and I are going to kind of harp on here because it's incredibly important. I grew up in Pennsylvania, where if you went into the backyard where I grew up, the soil just all looked like what's in the hands on the left in this picture. It was this beautiful sandy loam that just naturally crumbled up, and the roots of the new plants had no problem just going through it. So, of course, the plants were huge everywhere where I grew up. Now, I came to Texas, and the story I often tell is that I bought a house in San Antonio, and I picked up a hoe, and I asked my husband to go out and till up a little garden bed because I wanted to put some flowers in, and he came back in 15 minutes with that hoe in two pieces. Because we had very heavy clay, like you see on the right, there's heavy clay on the top and then maybe broken up caliche below. So it's a tough combination. We've got alkaline soil. Sometimes it's if you're down in the more towards the center of town, you might have deep clay. I have shallow clay punctuated by rock. Nathan's got sand at one of his properties way down in South Bexar County. So get it
6 feet deep, 6 feet
feet
of sand.
deep soil. Now, if you're
Forget holding water.
right, if you're way up north in Bexar County, you might not even have this amount of soil that you see in this image. You might really have seriously shallow soils. So our comment on this is you're going to have to plan for the soil you've got to be successful. Of course, you can do some amendments. You can add some compost to it as you're digging, but essentially you kind of have what you have naturally. If you've got super thin soils, take a look at garden style and look for hill country plants, things that thrive on thin soils, and prepare that bed really well so that the plant's going to have a best chance of success. And we're going to talk about what we mean by digging in order to plant that plant.
Well, it's really important when you plant a plant that you're giving it the right start. And there's a lot of old sayings about that, but there's one here that is really important. It's better to dig a $20 hole for a 50-cent plant than buy a $20 plant and use a 50-cent hole. Now, that's kind of an oldish saying, but it's true. You've got to have a place for that plant to start, and you don't just scoop out some soil and dump the plant in there and cover it up, and then you're good to go. We would like to sort of modify that saying a little bit to say, dig $100 hole for whatever plant you're going to buy. Give that plant the best start it can possibly have so that you can enjoy that plant for seasons and years to come.
Well, I couldn't agree with that more. We'll go to the next slide for some images of this. I moved into a new house. Like, it's not new anymore. I've been here almost 20 years, but there were some plants in the courtyard that were not thriving. And the prior owner told me he'd planted them quite a while back. And finally, I plucked one of those up. And it was a 1-gallon dwarf Yopon holly. And the roots were just circling around and around and around inside the hole, because it looked like he had taken that plant out of the pot, dug a hole exactly the size of the pot, not worked the soil at all. And that Yopon had just stayed in its original hole and never thrived because it never broke out of that original hole in that really tough clay soil. So in order to avoid that, we say, take your time. You know, if you buy a really big plant like the one on the left, you're going for it with any plant at least twice as wide as the container you bought. So if you buy a super big plant and you invest in that, remember, you're going to invest some serious time in that hole. And you want to go at least twice as wide. Now, in this case, this looks like pretty friendly soil that doesn't need much amendment. It's as deep as the container was. Now, in my yard, because I've got all this clay, I have to use a pickaxe to break through it. I just can't even dig a hole with a normal shovel. So I got this giant pickaxe and I end up digging this hole, and then I got clumps of clay, like huge clumps. It's either wet and it's sticking to the pickaxe and it's in clumps, or it's dry and it's these rock hard clumps. Either way, I'm breaking up those clumps with my pickaxe or my bare hands so that I can add a little bit of compost, but I'm fundamentally putting the native soil back in. I'm just breaking it all up so that as the roots are trying to grow out of that original container they were in, it's easy for them to get through. And I'm amending with some compost, but I'm not replacing it entirely because I don't want to create a pot underground. My other tip is, don't do what I've done sometimes, which is let those plants sit around for a while. Resist the urge to shop before you know you're ready to plant. I know we had a presentation on getting rid of the grass and preparing your beds. You really want to do that before you shop, because the nurseries are just really good at taking care of those container plants. We homeowners are not so much. So it's good to buy it, be ready to plant, be gentle, work at that hole. You want to add anything, Nathan?
Well, you know, that is so important, because a lot of times we get distracted. We buy plants with the best intentions, and then we get distracted, and sometimes that plant sits for a week or, you know, or long in that pot. And just imagine if you're wearing a pair of pants that's 3 sizes too small. That's what that little plant's sitting there doing after a few days in the pot coming home from the nursery. So you want to get that thing in the ground, let those roots start to stretch out and get into that neighboring soil. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Take a look at this seedling on the left and all of those magical root hairs that it's putting out to increase the surface area for water absorption, and to actually get there and start to get into that neighboring soil and fracture that soil and set itself up for success. And that's why we say, do this gently, plant these gently, because even a plant that's in a 4-inch pot or a 6-inch pot or a gallon pot, they still have root hairs, even though their root system is a little more mature than this. And so you wanna take care of them so that they have a chance to thrive. And if you look at that picture on the right, you can see this person's watering with a wand apparatus that has a nice rain spray on it. And you notice they're kind of pushing the plant off to the side so that they can contact the ground. And you want to water gently. Raindrops are always going to be more gentle than if you just have an open hose and you're blasting water into the ground. You're going to dig out a hole and you might damage the roots. And if you water over the top, especially on a brand new plant that may be a little wilty, you might damage the leaves. So gentle is the name of the game when you're starting off with these plants. Remember, they are toddlers. You got to treat toddlers gently.
So true. I see sometimes people want to have an instinct to really push in around their newly planted plant. And we say, no, 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 not necessary. Just put the soil around and then you're going to water it in and make sure it's still covering, evenly right up to what you planted, and you're going to tuck it in, but no need to shove it into the hole. So right here, what Nathan and I found is this image we liked that really summarizes our obsession with preparing that, knowing what soil you have and preparing that good hole for the plant.
Yeah, this is a great
pic. This great cross section that they made on Garden Gate, to give them credit for it. And I like to think here you see the native soil and you see they backfilled with what I'm going to assume is still native soil, somewhat amended. And the plant is sending out those starter roots. They're digging through the prepared hole and starting to get into the native unprepared soil quickly. The other thing I want you to take note of is the size of the root mass compared to the top of the plant. It's easy to forget that in order to support the top of the plant, which is what we like the leaves, we like the growth, we like the flowers, but without a really healthy root system, the top of the plant won't look that great. It's going to limit it, it's going to stunt it. So in this case, you've got that root system getting off to a great start for big, healthy top growth. And we're going to talk in a minute about mulch that they have properly laid down around the plant, but they're not smothering the new plant with it. So it's a great image for showing the benefits of taking your time and thinking it through as you put that plant in the ground.
For sure. Karen, we have a quick question from Rachel Cardenas, and she says, I have very clay soil. I am a novice gardener. I have been digging massive holes and backfilling with a mixture of the clay soil, topsoil, and compost. People keep saying soil amendment, and I just don't understand. If I want to put in a bush that doesn't love clay, should I just backfill with in-ground bed soil rather than the native stuff?
I would say no. I think you want to, the main thing you're really concerned about with your clay that you have is a couple things. Clay, once it gets wet, it holds water almost too well. And then when it's super dry, it almost repels the water. So it's a bit of a nuisance. It's got tiny, tiny particles that get really tight. And so the amendment that you're doing is doing a couple things. You're amending it just enough that you're helping infiltration. You're helping the water get down into the soil so that it doesn't just bounce off. You've probably seen when it rains, if your clay soil is showing at the top, you can see after a rain that you dig down, it's almost like the rain bounced right off. It becomes hydrophobic. So when you amend a little bit, you're helping the water get down in there. You're also helping drainage. So if you have just pure clay in a very wet period, a plant that hates wet feet, that likes to have drainage, can have a problem. So having said that, I would not backfill with totally new soil. You are discouraging the roots of your new plant from breaking into the native soil area. And that's ultimately what you want. Your plants have got to survive on what they have. And the root system is going to go far and wide past your planting hole. Even though you went twice as wide at least, and you stirred it all up and everything, in order for your plant to thrive, that root mass is going to have to go way past your planting hole into whatever you got natively. That's why we say, think carefully about what you have. If you got that deep clay, watch the drainage, you hope it's draining well, and doing some top dressing with some compost may help it. Digging it up carefully will help it, but I would not dig a hole and then say put potting soil or landscape mix in it.
Yep.
Nathan, you want to add anything to that?
No, it's you said it all. And Rachel, it's a great question. Thank you so much.
I'm sympathetic. I got a lot of that clay too. It can be a bear to dig in, whether it's dry or soaking wet. Either way, it's no fun to dig in.
Absolutely. So when you buy most of these plants, especially the smaller 4-inch or the 6-inch, the plants you're getting don't have a really big root system yet. So they don't have the ability to reach out and pull in moisture from around their environment as much as an older plant. And so they need a little bit of time to get past the planting shock and start to reach out. So you have to take care of them. You have to water them a little more often. And even a big plant like the one on the right, if you plant a big one, you still need to water it more often until those roots begin to spread out and get out of that hole and be able to take in more water. So it's very important that you take that into account. Look at those plants. Let them tell you when they need water. They're going to wilt after you plant them a little bit. It's just important to keep them moist so that they can continue to grow.
So the tricky thing I know some people are thinking, Nathan, as they're listening to you, is they're thinking, come on, Nathan, give me a schedule. Tell me exactly how many days do I have to keep watering that new plant? And then when can I go to once a week? And when can I go to once a month? So you're going to give them a straight answer, or are you going to tell them it depends?
Well, the true answer is it does depend, because there's sort of a general schedule to follow. So you want to water it at least a couple of times a week. But if the plant is wilting every day, it depends on the season. It's fall or summer or spring. But if the plant wilts every day, then it probably needs a little drink every day, not overwatered. But it just depends on season, the type of plant, wouldn't you say, Karen?
I would agree completely. So especially if you've taken a little 4-inch plant and you put it in the summer, that is a difficult proposition for that tiny plant. It's traumatized by being transplanted. It's in the Texas sun. And so you really need to keep an eye on it and give it that gentle, tiny amount of water relatively frequently until it gets past its transplant shock and starts to move out. The mulch will help, but I kind of think of it as like a house plant at first, that you put that little tiny plant in and you're wondering, am I drowning it or does it need more water? Put your finger down in there and see if it's getting dried out, it needs a tiny little shot of water. A pro tip from Nathan and I is, if you can, plant everything in the summer, get your bed prep done, know exactly what you want. And if you can wait to plant until you're near the end of summer, beginning of fall, it's a lot less TLC that you have to put in because the conditions aren't as hot. The day isn't as long, the night's cooler, and it's going to have our usually mild winter to get established before the heat of the next summer. So we always say fall is a great time to plant. But you could do it in the spring. I have and will again. I just realized that I may be out there with my watering wand a little more often if I choose to plant in the spring.
Yep.
Now, we wanted to talk about, I know there was just a presentation on getting rid of your grass. In case you didn't watch that one or you want another perspective, we wanted to just discuss that a bit because weeds are really what's going to be your primary enemy in year one. And so you want to think carefully about how to manage for those weed foes of your plants that are going to compete and make that new bed not look as attractive. So we wanted to show a little experiment Mark Peterson of SAW led us on over at the customer service center at what we call an inferno strip right next to the parking lot. So you see the bed on the left. Mark took half the bed and he sprayed the healthy grass with Roundup. And then this half of the bed, we eliminated the irrigation and just let the grass kind of start to not look good and be stressed. We took our interns out, we put them to work, laying down just one layer of newspaper right on top of that grass. And then they laid mulch on top of it. So this is an interesting strategy to consider. Not too much newspaper, not cardboard, which stays too long and can get soggy and become a problem, but it's just a layer of newspaper, which I have come to prefer to weed barrier, weed fabric that you can buy at the big box stores. My thing about the weed barrier is that it stays a long time. The plants start to grow on top of it. Some of the darn weeds grow through it anyway, and then it starts to pop up and look unattractive. So this compromise to me is a good one. So let's go to the next slide.
All right. So, in addition to newspaper and things like that to help with that, solarization is an option to consider. And solarization is the process of laying down heavy plastic over the area that you're going to turn into a bed and letting it sit for a few days. What happens is the sun's heat gets trapped under that plastic, and it cooks those weeds and weed seeds and grasses and whatever else is there. And it's an option that doesn't require a chemical or anything. And after a few days, when you pull the plastic up, everything is either dead or it's really yellow and not at all happy to be in that situation. You've probably seen it if you had a garbage bag or something, or a bag full of lawn clippings in your yard and didn't pick it up for a while. When you pick it up, everything under it's yellow because it's not getting any light, and it's sort of been heated up under that. And the most important thing is once you have everything going, it's about holding that moisture in. And so picking a reasonable mulch or a thickness of mulch to do that. And everybody sort of has a preference, but it's possible to not have enough, and it's possible to have too much. I like my mulch to be somewhere around 2 to 3 inches deep, because if it's deeper than that, when you water, the mulch is holding all the water. It's not getting to the soil. And if it's too thin, then you have soil exposure and you can get weeds coming in. Karen, what's your favorite mulch depth?
Well, I'm like you, Nathan, in that everything is difficult to decide how much mulch. If you're dealing with plants that like don't like to have wet feet, be careful of the mulch. I tend to lean toward 2 inches or so. I've heard Mark Peterson say 1. I did kill a mountain laurel years ago because I had laid down pretty thick mulch in a bed, and it was an established mountain laurel. I did not mulch it right up to the trunk, but during a rain event, the mulch washed up to that mountain laurel. I didn't notice, and then it stayed really wet, and the mountain laurels do not like that. Didn't go well for me. And then I've also noticed if the mulch is too thick, then I'll get a rain event and kind of scratch under that mulch, and it wasn't enough to make it to the soil. So it's a balancing act. You want enough mulch to cool things and help with the weed barrier, but not so much that you're either holding in excessive moisture, keep it away from the trunks of the trees and don't smother your plants with it. And then, letting the water get in. And, on that solarization, people have different opinions on how long to keep it there. It's not the most attractive thing. If it's super hot in the summer, it might go pretty quickly. And research does show that you're going to have fewer weeds later if you can maybe take the time to solarize before you plant.
For sure. And before we go to the next one, we had a question from Lori Packard. Where do you suggest to get the clear plastic that can be used for solarization?
I don't think it has to be clear necessarily. You're looking for a heavy duty enough plastic that it's going to hold up, and you're weighting it down with whatever you have handy. I've also heard cardboard can be helpful. I think the plastic, and sometimes people find black because it heats up fast, so black makes it even hotter. But you go to a home improvement store and look for some. You can experiment with cardboard. I wouldn't leave the cardboard there forever because it can get soggy and it just doesn't break down. But you're just really looking to deprive those weeds of sun and air and letting them heat up. So
Yep.
What material you use matters less than that you're leaving it there for a while to just frankly bake.
For sure.
So on our experiment of Roundup versus newspaper, I just wanted to come back to that if you were to go to the SAWS headquarters and see this near our entrance, we frankly did not find a difference between the Roundup area and the newspaper area that was significant. In fact, I thought there were fewer weeds in the newspaper area. So The challenge you're going to find is that even if you decide to use a chemical herbicide to eliminate things where you're going to plant versus these other techniques we're talking about, either way, eventually you're going to have some weeds come in. They will, weed seeds are going to blow in. There's still going to be some of what we call the seed bank that might be in that soil. So no matter what you do, you're going to have to plan to keep an eye on those weeds, especially in the new bed. So we're going to move on to kind of weed control options.
Yes. So, you know, there's weeds that occur in all seasons in San Antonio. You've got summer weeds, you've got winter weeds. And right now, everybody's yards are full of winter weeds. You've got henbit, you've got the winter grass, poa annua, dandelions are up and happy, you have horse herb. But the interesting thing, and we've had a lot of comments, especially after this deep freeze, is why didn't they die? And why weren't they frozen? And well, partially it's why they call them winter weeds. They are resistant to freezing temperatures. And normally without this super cold, we still have plenty of them coming around. And in this particular case, even with all the snow, it just insulated these weeds at freezing and then gave them a lot of slow trickle water as it melted. So you got to know that you're going to have weeds no matter what time of the year you're planting, and just be ready to battle with them. Do you have anything extra on that,
No, I
Karen?
think I agree with you, Nathan. It's always a challenge. You minimize it to some extent. If you've done these steps before you planted and you have some mulch, it will make it better. Now, before we move on from these winter weeds, which are a nuisance, but to me, they're not the toughest ones. I wanted to make mention of what I consider the really pernicious weeds that I just hate. Bermuda grass, it's going to come in. Even if you didn't have Bermuda grass in the bed, you're going to have some seeds blow in and the Bermuda grass is going to try to get started. And then also there's something called nutsedge, technically not a grass. It looks a little grassy. It grows in these shiny little clumps. Both Bermuda grass and nutsedge are just very resilient plants. After an apocalypse, these are going to be left. Bermuda grass has the ability to grow back from just a little bit of root left in there. Really, same with the nutsedge. My comment on these two is persistence. It's two things. Remember how important the roots are. We talked about the roots of the plant you want. Well, the roots of the plant you don't want are also important. Your odds of getting out every Bermuda grass root are not great when you're digging up root that you're pulling your weeds. But if you get at them early, you get them before their roots really get established, and use a tool when you see these two. We're going to talk about weed tools. I like to use a tool that lets me dig down a little bit so I can pull up more of the roots. Because the only thing I have found that works with these weeds is persistence and running them down. So if I keep at that nutsedge that's coming and I dig up the little nut underneath and the little runner rhizome, they're less likely to keep coming back. But just plan to stay at them and you're going to win. But we're going to talk about another strategy to minimize them on the next slide and then talk about tools, I think.
So, you know, one thing you think about is, of course, you have to water your plants, and whether you're watering with a wand or sprinklers or something like that. But think about this. If you have a big, beautiful bed, especially a brand new one where you have a plant here and plant there with a lot of open space, if you're going to lay down a sprinkler for the convenience of being able to water everything at one time, you are watering bare areas without plants. And those bare areas, or, you know, mulched areas or whatever, those might have weed seeds waiting for some water to germinate. And so you want to target those in the early stages of your bed. You want to use a watering wand or some other sort of handheld means to water those plants individually and avoid giving the weeds some free water. You know, aside from rain, that's unavoidable.
Yeah, so you'll notice that the weeds, like our regular plants that we want, thrive after a rain. So when it's really dry out and you're target watering your plants, you may not see very many weeds. And then we get a rain and our plants that we want all perk up, and so do the weeds. So I agree with Nathan about not doing broadcast watering helps. And then get out there after the rain if you possibly can to get on those weeds that are trying to germinate quickly. Again, hopefully before they either flower and make more seeds or they get a chance to get a strong root system.
For sure. Yep. Oh,
So this is going to get a little controversial. What do you think of chemical interventions, Nathan?
well, they're not my favorite because we have so many other things that we can do. And while the chemical things may provide some sort of convenience or perceived convenience, they typically introduce other problems that you don't think of right away. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, and weed and feed is one we never really recommend because you're talking about combining a pre-emergent herbicide with a fertilizer. And by the time if you're either applying that pre-emergent herbicide, the grass that maybe you want to fertilize or the warm season perennials are not really growing yet. So you're just fertilizing the weeds that are getting started. Or if you wait longer and it's pretty warm and the seeds of the weeds are already germinated, that pre-emergent herbicide is useless. So these products really should not be combined, and they are all the time. So I don't know anybody who's any of the garden experts locally who ever recommend weed and feed of any brand. We're not picking on these brands, by the way. It just happened to be these were images that I found. And on the weed killer in my beds, I wouldn't want the risk of drift and having it come over and hit my other plants. So on weed tools, I asked Nathan his favorite. Mine is on the left. I have two of these handheld tools because I got that tough clay soil. And if I just try to use a hoe, it bounces off. So I need something with some heft and some leverage to be able to break through that clay to get at enough of the roots, especially if it's Bermuda grass or nutsedge or something that's really got those pernicious roots that are going to get started. But Nathan, which one is your favorite?
I like the one there second from the left, the one for deeply rooted weeds, because most of the weeds I'm dealing with are out at my ranch place, which is in sand. A lot of those have tap roots, and so or they're really hard bunch grasses or bunch weeds, and so something that works for deeply rooted really helps me to pop those out. I can use a hoe down there if I need to because of the sand, but getting those deep roots is important to me. I have also used tools with the fork because it does help to break up the soil and loosen the soil around those roots so that you can get them out. So typically the two on the left, but you know what? You pick the tool for the task.
Yeah, in the winter months when I have the various winter weeds start to come into my beds, kind of on top of the mulch, I find that I can use something like what's on the right. Actually, my long-handled tool is one with kind of forked things on the bottom. And I find that I can rake through the mulch and get up a lot of those winter weeds. They tend for me not to be as deeply rooted. So it's sort of the tool for the task. If it's those tough summer weeds, I'm dealing with the handheld tool and I'm getting up close and personal with those weeds I want to kill. Versus the winter weeds, I can use the more back-friendly long-handled tool. But everybody's got their preferences.
For sure. And winter weeds tend to not be deeply rooted anyway. So that helps a lot. Oh, yeah. So, Karen, why don't you talk about this one? This is your bed, isn't it?
Yeah, the one on the left and the middle I planted a new bed last spring. So I didn't follow my own advice and wait for fall. I planted it in the early spring. And I wanted you to see the really newborn plants. They just came home from the nursery. You can kind of barely see them. And I spread them out. Frankly, I bet my colleagues are shaking their heads saying, I should spread them out even more because some of these are going to get big. So I put an example of a salvia that's going to get pretty good sized. And a couple months after planting, I was starting to see some blooms. I'm like, oh, good. I'm seeing some blooms finally. And then what I'm expecting is eventually this salvia in particular is going to get huge. it's going to maybe be 4 feet by 5 feet or something. It's going to be gigantic if it's happy. So there's an expression we use in gardening that's the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. Maybe my soils are tougher where I live or something. Sometimes it takes for me till year 4 or 5 before they really get to full maturity. But it really is true. They just kind of sit there and look at you, and they might not get very big. And then eventually you will be glad that you spread them out, because otherwise they will be too crowded as they come back and really come in full force. So I think our next slide is another example of this from.
Yeah. This is one of your neighbors, right? The one on the left is when the bed was planted, first year. You can see everything is small and spread out. The middle one was year number 2, and you can see with the right kind of weather and care how everything just absolutely leapt up and really started to grow. And Karen, if I remember right, when we were talking about these, the one on the right, we had the third year on, it was very droughty, and so they pruned the little salvias there in the foreground, and then all they did was bloom basically and grow right there, because the weather was not compatible to a lot of growth.
That's what this is Shirley Fox's yard. She just has a gorgeous garden. You can really see the growth of those, the sage in the background too, and the yucca. And the Salvia greggii had a good year there in the middle. They really took off. So you'd think we mixed up those pictures, but if I have it right from Shirley, that garden of hers had a great year, and that happens in San Antonio. We're going to have years where the conditions are just right. The rain comes at the right times, and then she's got great resilient plants here, so they still thrived in a dry year, but they're not quite as lush as they are when there's more natural rain. But the progress is astounding. You can really see how important it was that she spread those out so they're not too crowded as they're coming to more full growth. So I wanted to bring up what has happened to me in a couple of my favorite plants, that they took 4 or 5 years to go from sleeping to creeping to leaping to being too darn big. And I'm not picking on these plants because I love Turk's Cap and I like blue plumbago a lot. But I've had both of these in particular where I thought they were never going to get big. And then they turned into what we sometimes call plant bullies, and I needed to rein them in and take a pickaxe to them and chop them back because they were starting to take over their neighbors because they were so happy. So various plants will do that, and you just kind of keep in mind as you reach that maybe year 4, 5, 6, they may start to propagate themselves. I've had my Turk's Cap manage to leap across the driveway, get planted probably by some birds. And in some places it was okay, that's where it wanted to be. Same with my plumbago moved, and other times not. So this is not a bad thing. It just means you've been successful, but you can see this blue plumbago, it's actually trying to take over the sidewalk.
Yeah, it's being a traffic manager.
Yes. So, so they will get astoundingly larger. So when you look at that plant label or you read garden style, bear in mind, this could take a couple years, but it is likely to happen. And then eventually part of your management may be holding that plant back so it's kind of staying in its place and not taking over everything. Good problem to have if you get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last slide we've got for you before we can handle some questions is resources. GardenStyleSanAntonio.com, GardenStyleSA.com, either one, is a great place to go for San Antonio-centric information about your gardening and landscape questions. And we have tons of articles. Gardening 101 is fantastic for starters. We have a really neat section on planning and designing your landscape. We actually have diagrams for landscape by the numbers, if you will, that show long and skinny beds, square beds, rectangle beds, all irregularly shaped beds.
Sun.
Yes, and what size plants can go where, and then you can utilize the find a plant section of the site to then look for things that would fill in what your preferences are. But Garden Style San Antonio is a labor of love for our department at Saws, and you can see everything that's gone in. There's tons of articles written by our staff about all different sorts of aspects of gardening and landscape, water use, and so we really encourage all of you to go check it out and find those things that make your heart happy.
I particularly like that if you go to this garden resources, one of these little orange boxes is maintenance, and it will give you a seasonal checklist by each type of plant you might have. Your annuals, your perennials, your trees, your herbs. So that's really handy if you want like a really quick, easy to read thing, what you do each season of the year for your landscape.
Yeah. So with that takes us to our last slide. We do have some questions, Karen. And one of them here is, will plastic kill nutsedge in Bermuda? And the answer is no, because the plastic will get everything at the surface, but Bermuda grows from rhizomes and things under the soil, and the little nutsedges have a nut under the soil, and solarization is not going to get that. And so unfortunately the answer there is no.
I do find that the nutsedge is weakened though by all these different things we try. So when there's mulch that the nutsedge has to grow up through before it comes from that nut up to the surface, especially if you get it quick, it's weaker than it is if it's closer to the surface. And when you keep pulling at it, especially if you dig down a little bit and get to that nut and then the little rhizome to the next nut, the key is to weaken those. They also don't like shade.
No, that's true.
The nutsedge can grow in the shade, but Bermuda is a full sun plant mostly. And so as you use the mulch and your big plants reach maturity, they help crowd out that Bermuda grass. So it's really a matter of, with all of the weeds, getting your desirable plants to full maturity so that they're the plant bully over that Bermuda grass and other things that you don't want.
Yeah, we have a question here from Roberto. What is best for crabgrass? And holy smoke, crabgrass is one of those that produces a very large seed bank. And you could clean all the crabgrass out of your yard, and you'll still have crabgrass for years and years to come. Especially in a flower bed, you want to be able to have good mulch coverage, some sort of soil coverage, because if the soil is covered, you tend to not get that germination. As soon as you have a piece of soil that's uncovered, it seems like the crabgrass is magically there.
I also comment to people that if you've got a lot of weeds growing in your yard, one of the basic tips is to mow the weeds often, because you're trying to interrupt their life cycle. You're trying to not give them the chance to flower and produce seed that then's blowing all over the yard and into your garden beds. So mowing the weeds is actually helpful. It's great to pull them up if you're willing to pull them up, but mow them frequently so they don't get to complete that reproductive life cycle.
Yep. We have a question here. Are there any specific ideas for weeds and rock?
Oh, so maybe the question is aimed at that you've got, instead of an organic mulch, you've got rocks in a bed. And I will be honest with you and tell you that the rocks in a bed are not my aesthetic preference. And part of why is that I see them with the seeds get in the crevices of those rocks, and then you have weeds growing. So you kind of end up having a hand pull them between those rocks, maybe moving the rocks out of the way, pull the weeds out. So basically we find that the rocks as an option are not as maintenance free as people hope, but you're still going to have weed seeds blowing in. You're going to have organic matter that gets in between the rocks and helps the weeds start to grow in the rocks that you put down. So again, it's staying on top of it. Mark Peterson did share a formula that can help weaken the weeds. That's vinegar and orange oil. And I believe his formula was to go find 18% vinegar, which can, maybe
you got to go to a nursery to get that. Yeah,
nursery. You're probably not going to find that at HEB. and you're adding just for a gallon of vinegar, 2 ounces of orange oil and
Yes,
spraying that, and that will discourage the weeds and help knock them back in a relatively safe way.
it works really well. We have a video on that that we did a couple of years ago with this particular mixture. If you go to the Garden Style San Antonio area, look for educational videos. We've got one on this particular mixture.
Forgot about that.
And it's a good example of what you can do. We have a question here. Are there grass alternatives you can plant or seed over weeds that would take care of your weed problem?
That's interesting. So maybe you've got grass and you want to have a grass alternative. Nathan, you want to talk about that, those wildflower native grass mixes?
Right. So, and we did have a question about wildflowers earlier, and the biggest thing about wildflower seeds is and grass alternatives is that you just want to basically use a rake and scratch the ground, scratch the surface of the ground, and then broadcast these seed mixes over the top, and then just sort of walk over them. That's it. You don't want to plant those too deep, and you want to give them water. These types of things love sunlight, and so you want to have a nice sunny area, and then just water them a little bit every week as they come up, and they will eventually provide an area for you that will reseed itself over time and just needs a
What
little
about
bit of
what
water.
time of year to do it, Nathan?
The best time of year for wildflowers is actually in the fall. If you notice, a lot of our bluebonnets and all of our wildflowers are seeding themselves at the end of the summer and in the early part of the fall. And that's the best time for wildflowers in our area, rather than doing
them,
it in the spring. To plant them, yes, to put those seeds out.
My dad has a beautiful wildflower area in Hollywood Park, but it took him years to get it established. He laid down seed and he did try to keep the main weeds out. He did some hand weeding. And eventually he got a beautiful set of seed banks where things rotate through different flowers one after another. And it's just gorgeous. But it can take a couple years to get that native seed wildflower mix to truly get established. So have some patience as your seed bank grows.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question, and we have a question from Carolyn. I have an established corner garden with 20-year-old trailing lantana. It has some bare spots that I've replanted twice, but the new plants died. It is a favorite spot for neighbor dogs to pee. How should we refresh old beds?
Ooh, so what is resistant to dogs peeing on it? That's a tough one. I may have to research that. Nathan, do you know what will hold up against the dogs unless it's something prickly that discourages the dogs?
Yeah. You basically need something that needs an acidic soil because urine is very acidic and salty.
Point.
So you need something that can handle those two aspects. And, there aren't a lot of acid-loving plants
because our soil is so alkaline
that grow in San Antonio, unless you have sand. If you have sand, then you can grow some of the acid-loving plants. But for most of us, it's hard to do that. And so it's just a matter of perhaps treating those areas with some sort of a buffering material. Like, I'm trying to think, is it lime or something like that, just to help pull the pH up of the soil so that's not
and it may be affecting the foliage too. I wonder if the dogs are marking it. I don't know if you could watch the dog's behavior and make it a little less comfortable for them too, if this is just a handy spot for them. I remember at my old house had kids that would shuffle their feet and they'd walk four abreast as they'd go down the sidewalk and walk through my yard and shuffle right through all my plants. And I just, put a few prickly plants in their path. And it's amazing how quick those teenagers walking back from the the middle school would leap out of my garden bed back onto the sidewalk and kind of broke that habit. So you might think about what would make it less comfortable as a place for the dogs to do their marking their spot, marking their territory. Yep.
Well, Karen, I think we have had a good time, and we have answered some great questions today. And we thank all of you for joining us to talk about toddler plants. And we hope that you're able to have success with some of the tips that we've passed along. And
don't forget, there's still freeze talk at noon shortly.
Yeah,
just a few minutes.
Still freeze. And be sure that when we're through here to go over to gardenstylesanantonio.com, sign up for Water Saver Rewards so that you can get points that you can earn towards getting coupons for purchasing things like rain barrels or tools, mulch, and then other garden items.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I'm going to sign on and listen to Mark Peterson on the freeze.
All right. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.